So welcome everybody to our webinar on evidence and evaluation. My name is Richard Shiner and I work in the Access and Participation Directorate at the OFS, and I'm here with my colleague Beth Isaac, who also works on evaluation, and we're going to talk through our slides. And it's basically a run through of a workshop that we ran a couple of weeks ago. So if you attended one of those workshops, there is a lot of repeated content, so feel free to log off. So we're going to talk through the slides and we'll be finished by 12 o'clock. So we hope that by the end you'll have a much clearer idea of our expectations around evaluation in your A&P plans. You'll have considered your current approach and thought about ways that you might be able to improve your practice, and you'll have thought about how a self-assessment can be a useful thing to undertake in order to develop your strategies, and also hopefully you'll have a better idea of the resources that are available to you. So starting off, just talking through why we think evaluation is important, and this slide is taken from our recently published evidence and evaluation strategy, and hopefully I shouldn't have to convince you that with over £1 billion being spent each year on access and participation activities, we all have a collective moral imperative to try our best to understand the impact of that investment, particularly as it's funded by students and taxpayers with the aim of improving outcomes for students and reducing inequality in higher education. And if you're not convinced by the moral argument, there is a really strong value for money argument too, because if you're more effective with your money, then you're making a much more efficient use of that investment. And I think there are some really great examples across the sector of providers who are embracing evidence and evaluation in order to drive improvements in their A&P work, and we want to see more of those. And I think the sector has made really great improvements over the last 4 or 5 years in this area, but we do think there's still some way to go. So before I move on to what's in the guidance, I just wanted to talk through some of the, I suppose, myths and some of the key messages that sometimes come up when we're talking to colleagues about evaluation. And the first one is just to recognise that evaluation is very difficult, is a real challenge, and we are aware of the challenges around lack of time and resource, being able to access data and getting consent, or accessing academic and specialist support to help you analyse your data and interpret findings, but also accessing the skills to undertake evaluation in the first place. There are also challenges around persuading other people, often senior colleagues, of the value of evaluation, and then working with schools and in particular accessing data through them. And also I think there's a challenge around the competing demands of delivering activities whilst also doing the evaluation. And so we do understand these, and that's why we've produced better and detailed guidance on evaluation, why we've produced the self-assessment tool, why we're being much clearer about our expectations. And secondly, you'll never get a finding or a result from an evaluation that tells you for certain that something is working. It can only ever give you an indication that it might be working, and that will either be a strong or a weaker indication. It's up to you to interrogate that and to understand the claims that you can make. And we've published advice on standards of evidence that will support you to understand the types of claims that can be made from different types of evidence. There's no such thing as a perfect intervention that will work every time in all contexts for all participants, and at the same time there's also no such thing as a perfect evaluation design or approach that will give you the perfect result. There's always likely to be some compromise you'll have to make. That could be that you've got a small cohort size or low response rate to a survey, or you haven't managed to get a high level of consent, or you haven't got a perfect comparison group, etc. We're not valuing quantitative methods above qualitative, and we also believe that evidence of behavioural change is just as important as attitudinal change. We're not trying to drive everyone in the sector to be running randomised controlled trials, and we do hear and understand the concerns about them. However, I do think there's a time and a place for experimental methods, and when they're done in an appropriate environment by the appropriate skills and expertise, they can provide evidence of causal impact. And we sometimes hear concerns that it's unethical to provide a potentially life-changing intervention to some people and not others based on randomization. But we would take the view that unless you have strong evidence that your intervention is effective, then it's unethical not to be evaluating it. And that, in some circumstances, will give you a license to run a trial. So we value appropriate evaluation design for the interventions and the research questions that you're trying to answer. And experimental designs that can generate causal evidence are likely to produce the strongest indication that an intervention is working. And that could be using qualitative or quantitative evidence, but this is not common within this area and often just won't be practical. So evaluation is not an option, it's an essential element of your program delivery. It's not a tick box exercise, and it's not about keeping an audit trail. And you can't make the claim that something works unless you're evaluating it. And I sometimes hear people say they know something is working, but they haven't been able to generate the evidence to prove it. And although we can understand that position because we want our work to be impactful, and there's a good chance that it is, but without the evidence we can't be sure that it's a good use of that money, and also we don't know if it's harming students or not. The most important thing, which we'll be discussing throughout the webinar, is that you have a clear theory behind what you're doing. So you understand the change that you're looking to make, that you have evidence that a particular intervention can affect that change, and that you know how to collect the data to measure it. And if that's clear, you can start to build your research design on top of that. So we are setting higher expectations on the sector in the area of evaluation and use of evidence, and our new strategy has an ambitious goal that all providers are using evidence and evaluation to drive improvements in A&P. And we have 3 core areas where we think change is required. Firstly, there needs to be a commitment at senior level to prioritise evaluation of A&P work and to commit to using evidence to inform decisions. Secondly, we're driving home the importance of taking a strategic approach in this area where the design and planning of A&P programs and activities is based on evidence, and where decision and the quality of evidence are being challenged. And then finally, we want to see evaluation built into program design, a greater commitment to generating and sharing evidence, and a real commitment to learning from findings. So let's move on to our expectations in the guidance. There are a number of things that you must include. Firstly, you must demonstrate that you have a robust and credible evaluation strategy. You must show how you plan to improve your practice over time. You must describe how evaluation informs your future practice, and where you are investing heavily in particular activities, we want you to describe how you're evaluating those. We also expect you to have undertaken some form of self-assessment to help you identify the areas where you need to improve. And there are a number of resources that we provide to support your evaluation approach, including a toolkit for evaluating your financial support, and also an evaluation self-assessment tool that I'm going to talk through next. So the evaluation self-assessment tool has been developed by researchers at the University of Exeter over the last year, and it was part of a larger piece of research to support evaluation practice and improve the quality of evidence that's being generated. And it has 5 core dimensions: the strategic context in which the evaluation is undertaken, how evaluation and evidence shape current program design, how evaluations are designed and then how they are implemented, and then finally how learning from evidence and insight from evaluation is shaping improvements in practice. So we're encouraging you to complete the self-assessment tool because we think it's a really useful way to inform your strategy, because it helps you to identify areas for improvement. We also think it's a useful process to go through if you're an organisation that's trying to embed an evaluation culture. It applies to all types of providers and has been tested across a wide range, including small and specialists, new providers, post-92, highly selective providers, and completion of the tool works best when there is involvement across an institution. So I think it doesn't work as well if it's just one person completing it on their own, although I do appreciate that often in smaller providers it is often one person doing this work. But overwhelming feedback from the pilot was that when multiple people were involved in completion of the tool, it really helped to gain understanding and buy-in, particularly from senior staff. And the tool aims to assist providers to review whether their evaluation plans and methodologies go far enough to generate high-quality evidence about the impact of activities in their A&P plans. So the self-assessment tool does have a scoring system, but it is very much for your own use so that you can set a baseline to improve on over time. It won't be used by the OFS to scrutinize or benchmark providers. What we may use it for is to try and identify common areas of strong practice in order to identify and champion approaches, or alternatively to identify common areas of less good practice where we might need to target additional support, so give you more guidance or support you with training. So you're not required to submit your completed tools to us, but I would really like it if you did, because it will help us to support you. We aren't going to prescribe what your evaluation strategy necessarily looks like, because that's very much up to you and your context and the activities that you propose to implement. But what we are encouraging you to do is to consider the 5-point framework as you're developing your strategy, because if you're thinking about your strategy in this way, it should help you to identify areas where you could improve, even if you already have strong practice in a particular area. And so I'm going to start talking through areas within different dimensions in the tool. The self-assessment evaluation toolkit is it's in the resources tab on the right of your screen in the webinar, and also on our website in the promoting equal opportunities section of the website. So the first dimension is the strategic context, and this dimension is concerned with the extent to which an evaluation culture is supported and prioritized, including as part of a coherent program of evaluation across different activities, and also whether there are opportunities for staff to enhance their evaluation skills and understanding. And so what the tool does is that it asks a series of questions which you are asked to score yourself on, and gives you an opportunity to consider what your current approach is now and where you might improve. So here are some of the questions, such as is evaluation regularly and routinely discussed in your A&P work? Do you have the right skills in place to undertake the evaluation? So what do we think good looks like? Well, we think that evaluation will be prioritized by senior managers and delivery staff alongside the delivery of those activities. And this means that resources are committed to undertaking the evaluation and committed to the appropriate skills and expertise. And there are opportunities created for staff to develop their knowledge and skills in evaluation. And so what might you do to improve your practice? And this really does depend on your context and where you are on your evaluation journey. So some of this, if you're more developed, you may well already be doing some of these things. But if you're at the start of your journey, some of these things may appear more challenging. So one thing might be to ensure that there are opportunities to discuss evaluation on a regular basis and make this a priority in strategic meetings. Try and involve a wider group of people across your organisation, because although you may not have evaluation skills within your department, there may be expertise elsewhere that you can draw on. And it's really important to ensure that funds for evaluation are being ring-fenced and not used up through your delivery of activities. So the second dimension is program design. So this considers the rationale for your programs, the extent to which your program design and your choice of outcome measures are underpinned by and informed by evidence, and whether evaluation is built in at the design stage. Program design is not strictly evaluation, but we did want to include this element in the tool because it's an important part of the process and it underpins your evaluation approach. So again, there's a series of questions which I won't talk through, but you can see them on the screen. So again, what does good look like in terms of program design? So we want to see programs that are designed and underpinned by evidence. And that could be your own evidence or evidence from elsewhere. We want to avoid vague and unspecific aims and objectives. You should be clear about the change that you're trying to make and why you think your chosen activities can make that change. And ideally, you can describe this process coherently. So an example that illustrates the importance of good program design is having a clear logic chain or a theory of change. And our effective practice guidance on how to complete an A&P plan includes some advice on this, and our evaluation guidance produced by the University of Exeter, which is available on our website, provides more detailed advice. And we think that setting out your work like this is really essential. It's an essential planning tool, and it can start to underpin your evaluation approach. So even if you don't call something a theory of change or an outcomes chain, it's really important to set out the change that you're trying to achieve. So your ultimate goal, and in the example on the screen, there's two examples, but the top one around increasing chances of entering higher education. That's your ultimate goal. The changes that you'll see in the short to medium term, so your interim outcomes, in this example, there's increased motivation for schoolwork and therefore stronger GCSE attainment, and then the activities that you're planning to undertake to affect your desired change. And in this top example, some form of outreach activity that aims to raise aspirations for higher education. So as a starting point, it's really useful because it allows you to challenge some of your assumptions that you may not have challenged before. So how do you know that a summer school or an open day is going to result in increased attainment or increased knowledge of higher education? What evidence is that based on? How will you be able to measure if your activity is having an impact? Is there even data available to do that? So this top example, which I've taken from Neil Harrison from the University of Oxford, although he was at University of the West of England when he did this, it's some research on evaluation of pre-16 outreach, and it really highlights the importance of doing this. So it's a fairly common outcomes chain for pre-16 work, but when you start to unpack it, it falls apart because the only link in the chain with reliable evidence is the last one, in that improving GCSE attainment. There's very strong evidence that that will increase chances of entering higher education. And Claire Crawford's work has provided really good evidence of that. But the other links are quite spurious, really, and they have less good evidence. So other research from Neil Harrison suggests that aspiration raising won't necessarily result in increased motivation for schoolwork. And Stephen Gorard from University of Durham, his research casts doubt on the link between motivation and attainment at school. So it's just one example of an approach where you can see the value of unpicking some of these assumptions and really interrogating some of your plans. So what are some of the things that you might do? Well, we would recommend firstly developing a logic chain, if you haven't already, where you set out the money that you're investing, the activities that you plan to undertake, the outputs that those activities are going to deliver, and then the outcomes and the overall impact that you aim to achieve. And then beyond that, you might undertake a theory of change process where you map out your outcomes, identify your interim outcomes, and really challenge your assumptions that you're making before you consider what activities would be appropriate. And you may well need to work differently and be prepared to change your approach. So moving on to the third dimension, which is evaluation design. And there's no hard and fast rule about which impact evaluation research design is the most appropriate for the different types of activities and programs within different contexts. The tool does prompt you to think about the extent to which your current evaluation is proportionate to the activities that you're undertaking and the purpose and the claims that you want to make. So this dimension of the tool also allows you to map the types of impact evaluations that are in place across the breadth of your A&P plan programs as a way to unpicking the strength of the overall approach to generating evidence of impact. And the research has set out 3 different types of evaluation practice, so very high-level types, starting with narrative. So this is where a provider has a clear narrative for why it's chosen a particular activity and has a clear strategy for what change it is trying to make. So an example might be that there's very strong evidence that a particular intervention works in a similar context, and a provider has chosen to implement it in their own context. And that would be a fairly basic example, but it would be one that would be acceptable. So each type of evaluation can generate a type of evidence, and from that evidence there are either weaker or stronger claims that can be made. And I've put an example here on the right of a provider who has evidence from a previous evaluation that they undertook around the impact of their bursaries, and they've used that as evidence to continue investing in financial support, but for a slightly different purpose. So within this example, the provider can explain that it does have a coherent explanation of what it's doing and why, and it can say that its claims are research-based. Obviously, that doesn't interrogate how strong the evidence was in the first place, but at least it gives that narrative, which then you can start to interrogate and unpick in future. So the second type in evaluation design is empirical inquiry, or type 2. This type of evaluation collects data that shows that participants receiving an intervention have better outcomes following that intervention, but it doesn't establish any causal effect. So this could be something like a pre-post-intervention change, where, for example, where you're testing people's opinions on something before and then after the interventions. It's quite a common example. And this example that I've included, the provider is collecting survey data that shows participants have increased knowledge after an activity compared to when they were tested before. They also track these participants to see whether they end up in higher education and compare their destinations to a similar group who didn't receive the intervention. So in this example, they can demonstrate that their interventions are associated with beneficial results. And I would say that the majority of widening participation, AMP, activity evaluation falls into this type in empirical inquiry. But that is obviously going to include a wide range in terms of the quality. So what these types don't do is measure the quality, because there's various ways that you can improve the delivery of your evaluation within these different types. And then the last, type 3, is causality. So this is where there is evidence of a causal effect. This could be using qualitative or quantitative data, and the evidence generated suggests that participants receiving the intervention show positive change relative to a control or comparison group who didn't receive the intervention. This type of evaluation is not an expectation, but it is recommended for certain types of interventions, which I'll come on to on the next slide. And in this example, the provider is trialling a text message activity to improve continuation rates by providing links to resources. And they have a control group, and they've used randomization to ensure that they could isolate the effect of their intervention. And in this example, they didn't actually find any significant change, but if they had, the claim that they could make is that their intervention is causing improvement. So the research document that's been produced by the University of Exeter includes some suggestions about what type of evaluation is expected for different types of activities, but it's very high level and illustrative. Sorry, not indicative. So it's not prescriptive. But what it does say is that type 1 narrative is expected as a minimum for all types of AMP activities. Type 2 empirical is expected for more long-term or multi-activity interventions, including mentoring schemes, or more resource-intensive activities such as summer schools. And type 3, as I said, is not an expectation, but it would be recommended for more costly interventions or innovative and pilot interventions such as that text message trial. The other things that you need to consider when deciding on the different type of evaluation design are the proportionality. So your evaluation should be proportionate to the activities in question. Like I said, the most resource-intensive programs would require higher standards of evidence, because it would be risky to continue to devote a high level of resource unless you have good evidence that you're having an impact. But whereas the evaluation standards could be lower for less complex and light touch activities. Availability of evidence is also important. So the highest standards of evaluation are needed when there is currently little or no convincing evidence that the activity is effective, whilst activities that have already been proven to work may not require such rigorous testing. And then finally, utility. You should also make a judgment on the utility of the impact evaluation. So that is whether the evaluation meets the information needs of the intended users of the evaluation and produces and disseminates valid and usable information of impact that can inform your decision making. So what does good look like? As I said, this is more subjective dimension and will be very much based on your context, in the context of your activities. But what we're suggesting is that you select evaluation designs and methods that are appropriate to your activities based on the type, intensity, how much you're investing, etc. And choose your type based on the claims that you want to make. Don't just focus on your overall outcomes, but think about what might happen in the short to medium term and how you can measure that because often it won't be possible to measure the impact of your intervention on your overall outcome, but it will be more achievable to measure the impact of your intervention on those more short to medium term outcomes. Think through your assumptions and challenge those as much as possible and what evidence you are using, and ensure that you've identified people with the right skills and expertise to undertake the evaluation. And then here is some more detail on some of the things that you might do, all of which have been covered in previous slides. I'm going to pass over to Beth.
Good morning, webinar participants. It's Beth Isaac here, and I'm going to take you through the next two dimensions of the self-assessment tool, the evaluation implementation and learning from the evaluation. So firstly, onto evaluation implementation. The first thing I'd say is that in some ways this is the easier part of evaluation, and that's not easier in that there aren't challenges involved in this section, but they tend to be more practical challenges, so less existential head-rubbing, but more practical challenges of conducting evaluation research out in the field. So you've got firstly to think about the practical planning elements that you'll need to consider in the elements of running an evaluation. So in terms of your data collection, you need to think about sort of standard project management tools to keep everything on track and organise a complex set of resources and all the critical dependencies and the timings that are involved in those. You need to think about, in advance, your ethics and data protection. So if you need to go through any ethics committees to get GDPR approval from data teams, and you'll need to think about your practical data collection tools. So this is really thinking, so if you've identified your indicators, so you know which data sources that you want to use, this is really thinking about, okay, so how are you going to go out there and collect that data? So who's required to distribute surveys? Who's going to, are you printing the surveys? Are there online logins needed? All these practical elements. And also thinking about if it's not, if you're not collecting data from participants or other stakeholders, and you're expecting to access other data sources, so for example administrative data sets or school data sets, that you just need to make sure that you've got plans in place to be able to collect those, so data sharing agreements, those kind of things. You might be working with HEAT and the other longitudinal tracking systems to collect data, so you might have some really practical elements to think about as to how you're going to use these systems. So it isn't just a case that you can become a HEAT member and that everything else will look after itself. There is an extent of work that's involved in understanding the system, deciding how you're going to use the system, what data needs to be collected, who's going to collect it, who's going to input it, all those sort of practical elements. And you also need to understand the detail of your resources. So in the strategic context section, you would have been thinking about making sure that at a strategic level you have resources allocated for your evaluation, but you'll now be thinking about this in more detail. So budget lines and payments and those kind of practical things, if you're depending on resources, whether that's people, skills or other types of resources from other departments or other organisations, have you got the practical things in place that will enable you to access those at the right time? And we would also suggest for this area of evaluation implementation that it's really useful in advance to identify risks. So, and then you can think about how you can mitigate and manage those risks. And this is really, this is very standard kind of project management approaches, but thinking about what might be a key risk for your evaluation will help you think about the contingencies in advance. And there's a lot of common issues that happen in terms of evaluation implementation, low response rates, schools not being engaged, time not being prioritised in activities. And these are things that you can think about in advance, and you can put some processes, some activities in place that will help you manage these. And you also might need to think about the communications and support for others collecting data. So what do other people need to know about the evaluation, and when do they need to know that? So in terms of evaluation implementation and what good looks like, we'll be looking for robust project planning and risk management processes in place, that your data sources and collection methods are clearly identified and planned, and you can map those on, so all of the connections are made between your data sources and your indicators and your outcomes, so you know how that's all joined up. That you're using validated tools, so you've got common indicators that you can compare results with, and that your evaluation and activities around data collection are ethically approved by experts and are legally compliant. So we've covered the area quite quickly. I'm going to move on to what I think is the most important element of evaluation, and this is quite a rash claim to make, because if you don't have any design or implementation, then you're obviously going to struggle to have a learning from the evaluation element. But I think this is the most important element because it's often neglected, and if you are not learning from your evaluation, then your evaluation is really not much, it doesn't have much purpose. It's a box ticking exercise, and we would strongly encourage everyone to be trying to learn from their evaluations as much as possible, and also sharing evaluation findings more widely so that everyone can learn from the evaluation. So this area is thinking about understanding what you have found out from your evaluation, so what can you say, and translating that into practice. So how can you convert your evaluation actions, your evaluation findings into action? And you'll notice as we go through this that this connects back to the strategic context area right at the beginning. And you can think about this like completing the cycle of evaluation. So where you were starting at the beginning with strategic context, you're then converting that back into action and completing the cycle. So thinking about interpreting your evaluation results, and this is asking yourself what conclusions can you draw which are appropriate to your evaluation design and the evidence that you've got. We would recommend that you're transparent and critically aware of the limitations of your evaluation research design. I think, as Rich said right at the beginning, we do appreciate that no evaluation is perfect and everyone has to make compromises. But what's really important is that that's transparent. Everyone knows that there are real challenges around this complex area of evaluation, and it's not helpful to mask that. What is helpful is if everyone understands what an evaluation can say and what it can't say. So we need people to be really careful about drawing causal impact claims when they're making their conclusions, because these are often quite limited, and you will refer back to the standards of evidence that are on the OFS website to understand a bit more about what claims you can make from your evaluation evidence. We would also suggest that triangulating findings from different sources is really useful to strengthen your evaluation, and it also helps to get different perspectives involved when you're doing your interpretation. And you'll be thinking about what questions have you answered relating back to your evaluation objectives, and what new questions have you now got. And you might find it useful here to compare your evaluation findings with the existing evidence base to understand whether any of those other questions have been raised in the past, or maybe it might help you to answer those, or to go some way to answer those. And you'll be thinking about how you're going to use your evaluation findings, and this is really now into the practical elements of how you're converting your evaluation findings into practice. And this requires some planning in advance, so it's most likely there will be mechanisms needed within your organisation that will enable you to translate these findings into actual practice. And that might require some consideration of the timing of the programme design and when strategic decisions happen and how the evaluation feeds into those. And if your evaluation, there is a uncomfortable element here that if your evaluation doesn't support your activities, there's a big question to be faced with what are you going to do about it. We would just suggest that you do need to take some action off the back of that. And furthermore, we would ask that you are sharing your evaluation results internally and externally. And this again requires some planning to think about how you will share your findings and engage others with these findings. And again, returning to the activity and programme outcomes, whether the evaluation has shown changes as you'd expected or not, or something entirely different. And we would ask that people are committed to sharing findings externally, to help others move forward. And quite often when people share their evaluation findings, they do find that others have either got the same questions or might have some insight from their own evaluation or research which might help you answer your questions. And we would obviously also encourage people to share their findings with the evidence and impact exchange where appropriate. So just to break these sections down a little bit further, I'm going to think about what you might do in terms of interpreting your results. So for this section, I would say we can't advise for every single evaluation and design and method and analyses what would be appropriate in terms of interpreting your results, but we would offer some high-level advice, which is around just taking a critical approach and thinking about how you can improve the objectivity of your interpretation. And again, as I said before, being transparent about any strengths, weaknesses in the method, the sampling, or any other issues that you might know about or you can think about in your evaluation design. And it's really useful in the interpretation stage to draw in experts who can help you interpret and challenge your findings. And that also improves your objectivity, which particularly if you are internally conducting an evaluation of your own program, we would encourage you to think about ways to improve your objectivity here. We would say an over-reliance on one source of evidence, you should try to avoid that, particularly self-reported data. So ideally, what we're looking for is where an evaluation is drawing together data from different sources. And you should also aim to show how your results are related to the remaining body of evidence that is already existing. And what does it mean in relation to your outcomes? So in terms of what you might do in using the evaluation findings, and this is the practical mechanisms that are involved to convert that evaluation learning into practice. And this again will be different in lots of different contexts. If there are existing mechanisms that you can use, whether that's committees or strategic committees or anything which is your own internal mechanisms for governance and accountability, we would encourage you to hook into these. But you may well find that you need to put something new in place specific to evaluation. Quite often this involves establishing committees, advisory groups, steering groups, including specific agenda items, anything which improves accountability and engagement with people at a strategic level, but also practitioners. And you'll be thinking about your communications and engagement plans for this work. So you might need to involve your communications experts here. Not everybody likes to read long, detailed evaluation reports, so you might need to think about other mechanisms for engaging people and communicating findings and making sense of things together so that you can convert them into practice. In terms of checks and processes that you can think of to put in place to monitor those actions and recommendations. So an evaluation quite often will make recommendations. It's then about how do you make sure that those recommendations are followed through, or what kind of checks and governance balances can you put in place to ensure that. And then moving on to sharing results and what you might do. Again, thinking about internal mechanisms for sharing the results of your evaluations. And there's lots of opportunities to share your evaluation results externally so that you can contribute to the existing knowledge base of evaluation and effective practice. So I think my slides are slightly confused here. And thinking about different audiences when you're communicating your results externally and internally, thinking about what you might find useful from your evaluation for policymakers, what might be useful for practitioners, and what might be useful for other stakeholders. And again, you'll see here that when you're thinking about these mechanisms to communicate and engage people with your evaluation findings, you're really linking back into the things that you laid down as your foundation in the strategic context area at the beginning. So you'd be thinking about where are the opportunities to talk about evaluation, how can you join up your evaluation findings with students and academics and practitioners, and how can strategic leaders understand the evaluation and what to expect from it, and how this will help them in talking about the programs that you're running. So just finally then to move on to what good might look like in this area of learning, we'll be thinking about different types and sources of evidence and the methods that are used to draw conclusions. We'll see conclusions and claims of impact are reasonable and appropriate considering the quality and the type of the evidence generated. So thinking about the standards of evidence again. We'll be able to see that evaluation findings are objective and accurate. Evaluation findings are clearly related back to specific expected program outcomes, so linking back to really clear program outcomes and what the evaluation can say about those. We would be able to see that evaluation findings are also clearly related to existing evidence, externally or your own evaluation evidence. We would see reporting communications being transparent about the evaluation and the limitations that are involved in the design, and that there's a critical approach there. We would see structures and processes in place to support different roles and levels to learn from the evaluation, and we would see different stakeholders engaging and understanding and learning from the evaluation. So quite commonly, we'll see statements where people will say, we've decided to make these changes to our program this year based on what we learned from our evaluation last year. We would see the practice and choice of activities informed by evaluation findings, and results about what didn't have the expected impact are valued for the learning and still shared externally, which is sometimes uncomfortable, but we would see that that's happening and that providers are valuing the learning above perhaps looking good. And we would also see that the wider sector is engaging, understanding and learning from the evaluation so that findings are used appropriately. So that covers off the 5 areas, the dimensions on the evaluation self-assessment tool. I'm going to now hand back over to Rich, and I think we're going to move on to questions.
Okay, so we've had a few questions come in, which I'll read out and then try and answer them. So the first one, does program design refer to the academic courses taught to students or the program of work aimed at improving access outcomes? So sorry for the confusion, it's definitely the latter. So when we're talking about programs, we mean programs of activities to do your access and participation work. So you may have an individual activity like an open day or a summer school, but that might come within a program of A&P work. Second question, can I ask in terms of measurement for the example of the outcomes chain, GCSE attainment and HE access, would this use HEAT, for example? You mentioned ring fencing funds as a small and specialist institution. Would we be expected to invest in HEAT? The Guild HE has been investigating how a shared license may be a possible option to help with this. So that example that I've given is illustrative, high-level example, just trying to show that there is a clear link between GCSE outcomes and HE participation. So it's a simplified example. We're not expecting you necessarily to subscribe to HEAT or one of the other tracking services, and we do understand that if you're a small provider, that is challenging financially. But if there is an option for shared licenses in future, I think that would be a really positive thing. But if you were doing a particular piece of work where improving GCSE attainment was the aim of that work, then there would be other ways that you could do that. For example, working directly with the school to try and understand the outcomes. So the third question is, what level of program design work do you expect to see in the APP? Can we say that we're going to carry out this work in 1920 to help us determine our activities by 2020? For example, if we wanted to reduce non-continuation rates, so we'll do the evaluation of evidence and program design in 1920 so we can implement activity in 2020. So it is okay to say what you're planning to do within your plans. You've got to submit these plans within the next month or so, and there's only so much time that you have. And they are very much plans which start in next year, in over a year's time. So you do have time to build up capacity and capability, and they are planned. So they are also set over 5 years. So depending on your context, and if you can put a credible plan forward, you do have that time. But at the same time, we would encourage you to try and do that as quickly as you can. What we're expecting to see is that you're considering the evidence behind your program and activity planning, and that you're building evaluation in from the start. So the next question is that this will be a case for a number of providers, that you only have 4 weeks after the Easter break to produce your plan. What level of detail are you expecting to see within the 20 pages? Are you expecting completed program designs or just proposals for programs? So I guess similar to the previous question, obviously you can't put a great amount of detail in your plan because you're limited to 20 pages, and we do appreciate that. We aren't asking you to describe every design of your programs. What we want is you to demonstrate that you're considering the evidence in your planning, that you're clear on the aims of your programs, and that you understand how you're going to measure change. So we're not asking for lots of detail. We're not actually concerned with the detail of what you're doing, or we're less concerned. We're more concerned with how you're doing it, and that you have you're considering the evidence behind what you're doing. Okay, next question is, incorporating evaluation in the design of A&P plan design suggests the use of an evidence-based approach. For new providers that have not yet implemented A&P strategies, our evidence base will be obtained from what others or similar providers have done. If for any reason we do not have enough evidence to back our design, what should be done? Does the OFS have a database we can access? So firstly, I'd say yes, that's a good approach. So if you're new and you don't have your own evidence, then referring to what others have done, I think, is really sensible. We are developing an A to Z guidance of effective practice, which is on our website currently, but it's fairly basic at the moment, and we're building it up. But we will be adding to that over time. I think one of the other options for you in that example is to rely on other national evidence that has been published. HEFKI and OFFA and other organisations such as the Sutton Trust, and also BIS, Department for Business Innovation and Skills, published a national strategy for access and participation. That included a large number of literature reviews and a large number of evidence resources and links within that, so you could read that. Also, once the evidence and impact exchanges are up and running, that will be that database. So I've had a couple more questions coming in, so I'm just going to quickly read these, and then I'll be back to you in a second. So I've had a question asking, do the evaluations get reported to OFS in detail? Do you want to see our evaluation report? So ordinarily, no, we don't get evaluations reported to us in detail, and we don't expect to see your evaluation reports. Like I said, it's very much about understanding your current approach and your commitment to an evidence-based approach, and doing evaluation and improving your practice over time and identifying where you need to improve. If we had concerns about a particular provider, either through monitoring or if there was a specific condition put on a provider in relation to evaluation, then we may well request an evaluation report. But ordinarily, under standard kind of risk-based approach, we're not going to be requesting evaluation reports. However, although you're submitting 5-year plans, there is still a requirement for annual impact reporting. So on an annual basis, we will ask you to report back to us the progress that you've made, not just in terms of meeting your aims and objectives, but also how your evaluation approach is improving. But that wouldn't necessarily include your evaluation reports. It's more about how your practice is improving. So there's a question that we are reviewing our strategy for evaluating attainment raising activities. When will this section of the A to Z guide of effective practice be made available? So I think there is already some stuff up there on attainment raising. There's also a topic briefing which was produced by OFFA but is also on the OFS website on raising attainment in schools, which I would really recommend having a look at. I don't know when I can't give you an exact date of when we'll produce more guidance for the A to Z, but I would certainly recommend in the first instance having a look at that topic briefing. And if you're not sure where that is, get in touch with us, and we have a few people who'd be able to talk to you about that bit of work. So another question about the page limit. So given the whole of the APP is only meant to be about 20 pages long, how much space should be given to the evaluation, self-assessment findings and strategy? It seems there'll only be space for a very high-level summary. Yeah, so I think that's right. There will only be space for a high-level summary. What would help with that is using the tool, the self-assessment tool itself, and potentially submitting that to us so that you don't need to use up space within your plan, or just using the 5 dimensions as headings and putting a summary against each of those, I think will suffice. It is a challenge for us to try and assess your evaluation approach by just reading a short section in a plan. So we do appreciate that you can only give us a certain amount of detail, and that's why I think we're trying to put the onus back on you to assess your approach and identify ways to improve. So a question: for any evaluation findings to be shared externally, this will need ethical approval. What evidence would you need of ethical approval? For example, formal by committee or critical review by experts. So yes, absolutely, you'll need that ethical approval to share findings, and I think that is going to be a particular challenge for the Evidence and Impact Exchange, because they are imminently going to be putting out a call for evidence from evaluation findings, but a number of providers won't necessarily have set up their evaluation in that way. In terms of what we're expecting you to do, that's really up to you and your research and ethics protocols to make a decision about what is appropriate. There is some guidance in the University of Exeter's detailed guidance on evaluating outreach about gaining ethical approval, but I think having a formal ethics committee and having a research protocols that you adhere to sound sensible to me. But at the moment, we don't have any prescriptive guidance on that. There's obviously concern about the how much of the plan to dedicate to evaluation, because this is another question that's come up. So what proportion of the plan should be about evaluation? We also have to prioritise assessment, performance, discussion of target. So I would say that you need to fit everything into your 20 pages. So if you can only do a page on evaluation, that's fine. But I think the way that the plans are set out is that it describes your process from assessing your performance and identifying your gaps, working out which activities can address those gaps, working out what the overall aims of that work are, and how you're going to evaluate it. So it tells a story, and evaluation really should underpin that. So you could either have a separate section on evaluation or discuss evaluation throughout the plan. But we do appreciate that is going to be limited within a 20-page word limit. I'm sorry if I create any confusion with the submission date. So some providers, early recruiters, have a deadline of, I think it's something like the 24th of May, which is why I said within the next month. But actually, for many of you, you don't need to submit your plans until early in July. A question about sharing findings or sharing from your learning from evaluation, which is something that we're encouraging and I think would improve the credibility of your plan if you're willing to share findings. And then a question about how the OFS will support that. And one of the things that we're investing in is the Evidence and Impact Exchange, which is a forum or a repository for sharing your evidence. So a question here about how will it be viewed if we come up with something innovative but with less current evidence? Are we allowed to try something on the basis that we have a carefully embedded evaluation strategy and it might pay off or it might not? So yeah, absolutely. We do not want to be stifling innovation, and sometimes it does come up that if we're banging on about evidence-based design, that could be viewed as stifling innovation. So I think innovative approaches are going to be based on some form of evidence, but absolutely, we'd be really keen on you trying out new things, and as long as you've built a strong evaluation plan into that, then whether that ends up being impactful or not, I think is definitely a commended approach. So just a question about the impact reporting. What time of the year will the annual impact report be due? Will this start in 1920 or 2021? So I don't know the exact answer to that yet. So we are developing the approach to impact reports at the moment. There's one more round of monitoring the old access agreements to go, and then there will be the following year will be reporting on the first AMP plans under the OFS, and we need to decide whether we bring in the impact reporting straight away or whether we wait until we're monitoring the first AMP plans. I think that's still in development, and that would also include the time of year. So traditionally, we used to ask for monitoring returns around the start of the year in January, and I don't know if the move to moving away from annual submissions of the plans, whether we would also change the date of the impact reports, but obviously as soon as we know that, we'll let you know. There's a question here about the evaluation self-assessment tool, which talks about progression and student success programs in section 3 around the evaluation design. And it asks, should the self-assessment cover all of the work happening, or a proportion to get the flavour, or just those focusing on the APP gaps that we've identified, because this is from a particularly large institution? I would say it's really up to you and what would be helpful for you. We've designed the tool in a way that it potentially could cover all of your work, but also you could use it just to look at particular areas, or particular areas where you're investing heavily, or, like you say, areas where you have gaps, and I think that would be absolutely fine. It's really trying to understand your current approach to evaluation as a whole, but if you want to use the tool just to focus on particular areas, I think that's absolutely fine. So a question about how much detail are you expecting to see on the activities being evaluated in the A&P plan? Our understanding is you're less interested in the activities, so the inputs being undertaken to address A&P gaps, and focusing more on outcomes. A criticism we had of an early draft, though, was that we spoke a lot about how we're going to evaluate, but not much about what we're evaluating. So yeah, I would say we are less interested in those activities, and we are more interested in your overall approach and your planning and your strategy and your approach to evaluation. But if we do say within the guidance that if you are investing particularly heavily in a program, so it could be your flagship program, for example, then we would like to have some more detail about how you're specifically evaluating that program. The question here: what if we have only very recently started activities and tracking the impact of those activities with a very short prior history to evaluate? So we do understand that we're regulating a very diverse sector, and some providers are brand new to the system and won't have a lot of data to understand the impact of their work, and may well be at a very early part of the journey in terms of their evaluation approach. And so we will look at the different context and be proportionate in our approach to assessing your plan, and we will understand if you don't have that much data yet. And like I say, you've got time to build up some of that understanding, some of that capacity, not just in terms of when your plan will begin next year, but also that you've got 5 years to build up that time. But what we want to see is that you have a credible plan to doing the best you can to try and understand the impact of your work over time. So there's just a question about the current OFS A to Z part of the website, which is around effective practice, doesn't yet have anything on effective practice on raising attainment or continuation and attainment, and that the OFS is asking providers to have a clear plan based on evidence, but particularly for smaller providers, you can't access evidence via our website, and therefore you have to do this assessment of external evidence in just a few short weeks. So that A to Z guidance is new, and it's something that we've only just recently been developing. So we've put up on the website as much as we possibly could at this point, but we will keep adding to it as time goes on. I do appreciate you've got to submit your plans in a short time, but using evidence to inform what you do is not a brand new thing. You've always been asked to do that, and so it should be a continuation of the work that you're doing. And we are asking you to look elsewhere and not just rely on the OFS to be providing that evidence for you. Actually, that's your responsibility to understand that within your own context and to understand what the national evidence is saying. So we're providing more support than we've done previously through the A to Z guidance, more toolkits and guidance on evaluation, these webinars and workshops and briefings, and we're also certainly increasing the expectations on you to look for that evidence as well. The question, can we use a combination of evaluation types, such as type 1 and 2, in order to evaluate a particular strategic aim and objective? Yeah, absolutely. You can. There's no prescription from us about the types. They're not, and I should have said this actually in the presentation, they're not hierarchical. So it's very much about what's appropriate for the intervention that you're using, and you may well want to use various different types for a particular aim and objective, or for one particular activity. You low cost, low intensity, and you have fairly good evidence. You might be satisfied by just having a really clear narrative about what you're doing and why. But for something else where you're less sure that it's impactful, you might have that narrative and then start to undertake some evaluation on top of that to generate type 2 or type 3. So it really is up to you and the context and what you're trying to evaluate. So that I've come to the end of the questions. I'll give it some time to see if any more come in. So we'll stay online for a bit, and if some come in, I'll let you know. All right. So we've had another question. Where something is done in response to student feedback and seems obvious, do we have to have a detailed evaluation plan? For example, students frequently ask for more non-sporting clubs and societies, and we think this could help retention. But even if it doesn't, it feels right to respond. Are you saying we shouldn't work on this unless we can prove it works? Or are you just saying leave it out as a specific APP program until and unless we can prove it works? Is it in that case just standard day-to-day student improvements for all? So I think I'd say that obviously student feedback is incredibly important, and you should definitely be listening to what your students are telling you. This maybe doesn't feel like a specific AMP plan activity which has the aim of reducing gaps. So perhaps you could leave it out of your plan if it is about making more student improvements for all. I would say though, if you're investing in a particular activity, regardless of its AMP work, then I would expect you'd want to know whether it's working or not, and student feedback would be one of the ways that you could understand that. But if you're particularly investing heavily in something, then I would recommend evaluating it. But I do appreciate what you're saying in this example. Certainly not saying don't do it just because you can't prove it, although I would always encourage trying to understand whether something is impactful. Okay, so I think we're going to end it there. Thank you for listening, and thanks for lots of really great questions. If you need to get in touch with us, you can give us a call, or we have our APP at OFS, at officeforstudents.org.uk email address, and if you send it to that, it will then get through to the right people if you say it's in relation to evaluation. Okay, thank you very much.